The ocean tasted like iron and salt, and Werner Krauss could not stop his hands from shaking. He sat inside the belly of U-202, a German submarine that had crossed 3,000 miles of Atlantic water to deliver him to his death. Around him, 3 other men breathed in the darkness. None of them spoke. The diesel engines groaned beneath their feet, and somewhere above, the coast of Long Island waited in fog so thick it swallowed the stars. It was June 13, 1942. America had been at war for 6 months. And Werner was about to become one of its enemies. The mission was called Operation Pastorius, named after the founder of the first German settlement in America. The Abwehr, Hitler's military intelligence, had selected 8 men for the job. 4 would land here, on Long Island. 4 more would arrive in Florida days later. Their orders were simple: destroy aluminum factories in Tennessee, blow up railroad bridges in Pennsylvania, cripple the hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls. They carried enough knowledge and enough money to wage a secret war on American soil. But as Werner climbed into the rubber raft that would carry him to shore, he wondered if any of them truly believed they would survive. Otto Falk was the youngest, only 24, born in Munich but raised in New Jersey until his family returned to Germany in 1933. He smiled too much, laughed at things that were not funny, and kept touching the pistol hidden under his coat as if it might vanish. Heinrich Baum was quiet, an engineer who had studied in Pennsylvania and still dreamed in English. Karl Unger was the oldest, a former waiter from Hamburg who never explained why he volunteered. He carried a photograph of his 6-year-old son in his coat pocket and looked at it every night before sleeping. The raft scraped against sand, and Werner felt American soil beneath his boots for the first time in 4 years. He had lived here once, selling insurance in Chicago, eating hot dogs at baseball games, learning to love a country that now wanted to destroy his homeland. He stood frozen on the beach, fog pressing against his face like wet cloth. The others climbed out behind him, dragging crates filled with explosives, timers, and detonators. No one made a sound. In the distance, waves crashed against the darkness, and somewhere out there, the submarine was already sinking back into the deep. Werner whispered the first words any of them spoke on American soil. They came out in English, not German. God forgive me for what I am about to do. Otto laughed, a nervous sound that died quickly in the fog. We are already dead men, he muttered. We just don't know it yet. They buried the crates in the sand, working fast, their breath visible in the cold June air. The Abwehr had trained them for weeks at a farm outside Berlin, teaching them how to build bombs, how to blend into American cities, how to lie. But no training could prepare them for this feeling, the weight of betrayal, the knowledge that every step forward was a step toward something unforgivable. Werner buried his wedding ring alongside the explosives. His wife, Margaret, was still in Berlin. He had told her he was going on a business trip. He had kissed her goodbye and promised to return. Now, standing on this beach, he knew he never would. A figure emerged from the fog. Werner saw him first, a young man in a Coast Guard uniform, alone, unarmed, walking patrol along the shoreline. John Cullen was 21 years old, a seaman second class, earning $21 a month to guard beaches that no one believed the enemy would ever reach. He stopped when he saw the 4 shapes in the darkness. His flashlight beam cut through the mist, and for one terrible moment, everyone froze. Werner stepped forward. His German accent was thick, but his English was good enough. He told the boy they were fishermen from Southampton, that their boat had run aground, that they were waiting for sunrise. John Cullen did not believe him. His eyes moved to the half-buried crates, to the men's wet clothes, to the fear in their faces. But he was alone. He had no weapon. And there were 4 of them. Werner pressed $200 into the boy's hand and told him to forget what he had seen. John took the money and walked away. But he looked back. And Werner knew, with absolute certainty, that this boy would not stay silent. They finished burying the evidence and disappeared into the fog, walking toward the train station at Amagansett. Behind them, John Cullen was already running toward the Coast Guard station, his heart pounding, the crumpled bills still clutched in his fist. Within hours, investigators would find the buried crates. Within days, the largest manhunt in American history would begin. But for now, Werner and his men walked through the darkness, for ghosts in a country that did not yet know they existed. The mission had barely begun, and already it was falling apart. Times Square glowed like a fever dream, and Heinrich Baum stood in the middle of it, drowning. Neon signs blazed above him, Coca-Cola, Camel cigarettes, Broadway shows, while thousands of Americans pushed past without seeing him. It was June 15, 1942, 2 days since they had crawled out of the Atlantic like men escaping their own graves. The newspapers were full of war. Rommel was advancing in North Africa. Japanese forces controlled half the Pacific. And here, in the heart of New York City, people ate hot dogs and danced to swing music as if the world were not burning. Heinrich had not been home in 8 years. And now he was here to destroy it. The 4 men had separated after reaching Manhattan, splitting into pairs to avoid suspicion. Werner and Karl checked into the Governor Clinton Hotel under false names, paying cash, speaking little. Heinrich and Otto took rooms at the Martinique, a cheaper place on West 32nd Street where no one asked questions. The Abwehr had given them nearly $90,000 in American currency, enough to live comfortably for months while planning their attacks. But money could not buy silence, and it could not cure the sickness growing inside Werner's mind. Heinrich walked through the city like a ghost wearing human skin. He passed the public library where he had once studied for his engineering exams. He saw the diner on Lexington Avenue where a girl named Clara had poured him coffee every morning in 1934. She had kissed him goodbye at Penn Station when he sailed back to Germany, and he had promised to write. He never did. Now he wondered if she still worked there, if she would recognize him, if she would scream when she learned what he had become. He did not go inside. Some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. Otto handled the pressure differently. He smiled, he joked, he made friends. At the hotel bar, he met a young widow named Margie whose husband had died at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. She was lonely. He was charming. They talked about baseball, about music, about nothing that mattered. Otto told her his name was Frank, that he worked in sales, that he was from Philadelphia. Every word was a lie, and every lie tasted like poison. But when Margie laughed, he almost forgot why he was here. Almost, Werner was falling apart. He spent hours locked in his room, drinking whiskey, staring at maps of factories he was supposed to destroy. The Aluminum Company of America plant in Tennessee. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway Bridge. The Hell Gate Bridge in New York. He knew the targets by heart. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw John Cullen's face in the fog, that young Coast Guardsman who had walked away with cash in his pocket and suspicion in his eyes. The FBI would find the buried crates. They would trace the explosives. They would hunt him down like an animal. Werner had been a fool to think otherwise. On the third night, he called a meeting in his hotel room. The 4 men sat in silence while Werner paced, his hands trembling, his voice cracking. He told them he could not do it. He could not murder innocent Americans. He could not destroy the country that had once welcomed him as a friend. He was going to turn himself in, walk into FBI headquarters, confess everything, and hope for mercy. The others stared at him as if he had grown a second head. Karl spoke first, his voice flat and cold. If you betray us, they will execute us all. Otto laughed bitterly. They will execute us anyway. The mission is already dead. Heinrich said nothing. He simply looked out the window at the city lights, remembering a girl who poured coffee and a promise he never kept. He wondered if surrender was cowardice or courage. He wondered if it even mattered anymore. Werner made his decision. Tomorrow morning, he would walk into the FBI field office at Foley Square and tell them everything. He would give them names, locations, targets. He would hand over the money, the explosives diagrams, the entire operation. Maybe they would spare his life. Maybe they would not. But at least, for the first time since he climbed into that submarine, he would be able to sleep. The other three men returned to their rooms without speaking. Otto sat on his bed and wrote a letter to Margie that he would never send. Karl held his son's photograph and whispered a prayer in German. Heinrich stared at the ceiling and thought about bridges, not the ones he was supposed to destroy, but the ones he had burned long ago. Outside, New York City hummed with life, unaware that 4 men had come to tear it apart. And now, one of them was about to tear them apart instead. The FBI agent looked at Werner Krauss as if he were insane. It was June 19, 1942, and Werner had been waiting in the lobby of the FBI field office for nearly 3 hours, clutching a leather briefcase filled with more money than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. He had told the receptionist he had information about German spies. She had nodded politely and asked him to wait. Now, finally, a junior agent named Dwayne Traynor sat across from him in a cramped interview room, arms crossed, patience thin. "You're telling me," Traynor said slowly, "that you are a German saboteur, that you landed on Long Island a week ago, and that there are 7 other men just like you currently hiding in American cities?" Werner nodded. Traynor sighed. "Do you have any proof?" Werner opened the briefcase. $84,000 in cash spilled across the table like green rain. Stacks of 20s, 50s, 100s, more money than the agent would see in his entire career. Werner's hands were steady now. The decision had been made. There was nothing left to fear. "I have names," he said quietly. "I have targets. I have everything." Traynor stared at the money for a long moment. Then he stood up and left the room. When he returned, he was not alone. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, would later take credit for cracking the case through brilliant investigation. In truth, Werner Krauss handed him everything on a silver platter. The interrogation lasted hours. Werner described Operation Pastorius in exhaustive detail, the training camp near Berlin, the submarine voyage, the landing on Long Island, the buried explosives, the 4 men who had arrived in Florida 3 days after them. He gave up every name, every address, every target. He betrayed everyone, including himself. By midnight, FBI agents across the country were moving that in New York, Otto Falk was playing cards with 2 strangers at a bar near the Martinique Hotel. He was winning, laughing, pretending to be someone he was not. When the FBI agents walked in, he did not run. He simply folded his cards, finished his drink, and stood up. "I wondered when you would come," he said. They found a letter in his pocket, addressed to Margie, confessing everything. He had written it 3 days ago and never mailed it. Now he handed it to the agents and asked them to deliver it. They never did. Heinrich Baum was sitting in Central Park, feeding pigeons, when they found him. He had been there for hours, watching children play, listening to birds sing, thinking about all the lives he had failed to destroy. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply stood up, brushed the crumbs from his coat, and walked toward the waiting car. One of the agents asked him why he had not tried to run. Heinrich smiled sadly. "Where would I go?" he said. "I have been running my whole life. I am tired." Karl Unger was the hardest to find. He had moved to a boarding house in Queens, paying cash, using a name he had invented on the submarine. But Werner knew the address, and Werner had told them everything. When the agents knocked on his door, Karl was sitting on his bed, holding his son's photograph. He looked up at them with eyes that held no fear, only sorrow. "Will you tell my boy I was brave?" he asked. The lead agent, a man named Richard Donegan, said nothing. What could he say? How do you explain to a child that his father came to America to kill, and died without firing a single shot? The arrests happened quickly, quietly, without gunfire or drama. Within 72 hours, all 8 saboteurs were in custody, 4 from Long Island, 4 from Florida. The newspapers never learned about the operation until after it was over. J. Edgar Hoover held a press conference and announced that the FBI had uncovered and neutralized a major German plot through diligent investigative work. He did not mention Werner's confession. He did not mention the $84,000. He made it sound like a victory of American intelligence, not a failure of German nerve, but in the holding cells beneath the federal courthouse, 8 men waited for judgment. They had crossed an ocean to destroy a nation. They had carried bombs, diagrams, and dreams of victory. Now they had nothing but memories and regret. Werner sat alone in his cell, wondering if his betrayal would save him. Otto thought about Margie, about her laugh, about the life he might have lived if history had been different. Heinrich remembered Clara's face at the train station, a goodbye that should have been forever. And Karl held his son's photograph and whispered, over and over, "I am sorry. I am so sorry." The trial would begin soon. And when it ended, most of them would die. The military tribunal convened on July 8, 1942, inside a converted assembly room on the 5th floor of the Department of Justice building. No journalists were allowed. No family members. No public observers. Just 8 men in chains, 7 army officers serving as judges, and 2 prosecutors who had already decided the outcome. President Franklin Roosevelt himself had ordered the secret trial, bypassing the civilian courts entirely. The message was clear: these men were not criminals. They were enemies of war. And enemies of war did not deserve mercy. The trial lasted 18 days. The prosecution presented evidence that would have taken months to gather in a normal courtroom: explosives recovered from Long Island and Florida beaches, training manuals with detailed instructions for sabotage, confessions signed by all 8 defendants. Werner Krauss testified against his comrades, describing every detail of Operation Pastorius in his flat, exhausted voice. He had been promised consideration for his cooperation. He clung to that promise like a drowning man gripping driftwood. But promises made in interrogation rooms rarely survive the courtroom. The defense attorneys, military officers assigned to an impossible task, argued that the men had never actually committed sabotage. They had landed, yes. They had carried explosives, yes. But they had harmed no one, destroyed nothing, completed no mission. Was intention alone enough to warrant death? The presiding general, Frank McCoy, listened patiently. Then he reminded the court that these men had arrived on American soil wearing German military uniforms, carrying instruments of destruction. Under the laws of war, that made them unlawful combatants. The penalty for unlawful combatants was death. Otto Falk sat through the proceedings in silence. He had stopped caring about the outcome days ago. At night, in his cell, he wrote letters to Margie that would never be delivered, long, rambling confessions of love and regret. He told her about Munich, about his childhood, about the moment he realized he had made a terrible mistake. He told her he wished they had met in a different world, a different time, when he could have been the man she deserved. He signed every letter with his real name, not the fake one he had given her. She would never read them. But writing them made him feel human again. Heinrich Baum requested only one thing: a Bible. He was not particularly religious, but he remembered the church his mother had taken him to as a child in Hamburg, the stained glass windows, the smell of candle wax, the priest who spoke of forgiveness. He read the same passages over and over, searching for something he could not name. Peace, perhaps. Or absolution. He found neither. But the words filled the silence, and that was enough. Karl Unger spent his final days writing to his son. He did not mention the trial, the mission, or the war. He wrote about fishing trips they had taken together before he left Germany. He wrote about the stars, about the importance of kindness, about how much he loved him. He told Dieter to be strong, to take care of his mother, to become a good man. He did not say goodbye. Goodbyes were for people who expected to meet again. Karl knew better. On August 3, 1942, the tribunal delivered its verdict. All 8 men were found guilty of violating the laws of war. 6 were sentenced to death by electrocution: Otto Falk, Heinrich Baum, Karl Unger, and 3 others from the Florida team. Werner Krauss and 1 other man received prison sentences: 30 years for Werner, life for the other, as reward for their cooperation. Werner wept when he heard the verdict. He had betrayed everyone to save himself, and in the end, he had saved nothing. He would spend decades in a cell, haunted by the faces of men he had sent to die. The executions took place on August 8, 1942, at the District of Columbia Jail. The men were brought to the electric chair one by one, in alphabetical order. No final statements were recorded. No family was notified. They died alone, in silence, witnessed only by military officials and a prison chaplain who later said he had never seen men face death with such resignation. Carl was the last of them. He walked to the chair without assistance, sat down calmly, and closed his eyes. In his pocket, guards later found the photograph of his son, worn soft from years of handling. They buried it with him in an unmarked grave. The war continued. Factories kept producing. Bridges stood unharmed. America never knew how close it had come to terror on its own soil. J. Edgar Hoover became a hero. Operation Pastorius became a footnote. And somewhere in New York City, years after the war ended, an aging widow named Margie found a faded photograph in her attic, a man with a kind smile and sad eyes, a man who had called himself Frank. She stared at it for a long time, remembering laughter, remembering lies. Then she burned it and watched the smoke rise toward the ceiling. Some memories, she decided, were better left as ashes.